Hello friends, here we go. 2 more chapters left in the book of Numbers. And today we're doing Numbers chapter 35, the whole lot. And the question I'm asking is, does God have special places? And what does he want and require of those special places? Yes, today we're going to try and cover all 34 verses of Numbers 35. Years ago, I travelled around quite a bit with my job. I lived in different places in the UK. And during that time, I discovered something interesting. I first moved to the mainland UK from Northern Ireland in the mid-1980s. And everywhere I went, people seemed to believe that their area was special, if you like. Whether it was the north or the south, I haven't lived in the east, but I also lived in the west. And wherever I went, people seemed to sincerely think that their location was the best place to live in the United Kingdom. It became almost humorous to me because after I settled in the county of Lancashire, which is in the northwest of England, about 30 years ago, I realised that Lancastrians really thought that their place was the best, particularly in relation to their close neighbours in the county of Yorkshire. And they were deadly serious about this. Just put the search term "the War of the Roses" into your search engine if you want to see how long this rivalry has been in place. Now, I don't know if God really has a favourite place. Maybe the whole planet is God's favourite place in this uniform. However, I do know that in the Old Testament there were some special cities, special towns that he personally designated as having special roles. We might call these God's cities or God's towns, as God's servants lived there and they served God's purposes in those places. These special towns and cities in the Old Testament, I believe, still teach us a truth that's vital we understand today, and something that our nations need to understand and to build into their infrastructure and legal processes to this day. And that's what we're going to look at in today's episode of the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Okay, we're going to turn to Numbers chapter 35 today, friends, and we're going to talk about the special cities of God. What were they? What were their purpose? What was he designating them? Why was he designating them as special cities? There's overall one set of cities, but within that it's divided into 2 parts. We're going to talk about the same set of towns and cities that are designated, but note that within that larger group there's a subset, if you like, a special, smaller group with a very special designation. So first we'll discuss the overall idea of towns and cities, these ones that are allocated to the Levites, and there's 48 of them in total actually, and these cities were given to the Levites firstly as a place to live, and they were given because they didn't receive a land inheritance like the other tribes. And the Levites were going to be set apart for special service to God. We know that already, but these cities now, after entering their land, these cities are going to be scattered throughout the whole land that they're conquering to ensure the presence of Levites and their specific influence was widespread throughout the cities. And then after that, we're going to look at this subsect called the cities of refuge, because among these 48 cities, 6 are going to be designated with this special title. These are the cities that have a special purpose. They are the place where someone who's accidentally killed another person could actually flee for protection. The cities of refuge will provide a safe haven for individuals, in a sense seeking asylum, until a fair legal trial can be conducted under the Mosaic system. This system of cities ensured that justice was tempered with mercy and that due process would take place. So our outline from this chapter will be, I'm going to cover the cities of the Levites, first of all talking about the general designation of all the cities, and then we'll focus on these 6 cities designated as these cities of refuge and what that really means and what that really means for us today. So let's jump into the text, starting with the first 3 verses, which say, "On the plains of Moab, by the Jordan, across from Jericho, the Lord said to Moses, Command the Israelites to give the Levites towns to live in from the inheritance the Israelites will possess, and give them pasture land around the towns. Then they will have towns to live in, and pasture land for cattle, their own and all other animals." So this passage first of all designates the concept of towns set apart for the Levites. Now, as we've seen already in Numbers, God gave the land to these whole 12 tribes, but he didn't actually give any land to the Levites, did he? Their inheritance was to be different. It was to serve the Lord at the tabernacle, as stated in Numbers 18:20. So they do not receive land, widespread areas for agricultural development, if you like, or for farms. Their inheritance was the privilege of serving in the tabernacle and applying the Levitical legal system throughout the whole land. So instead of regional land allotment, they're given cities in which to live and small areas of land around them. Now, there's a total of 48 cities given to the Levites. And this passage doesn't name them as such, but it outlines that these cities should have an area of common land around them. And the first 3 verses just specify the principles of this situation. So reading a couple more verses, it says, "The pasture lands around the town that you give to the Levites will extend 1,000 cubits from the town wall. Outside the town measure 2,000 cubits on the east side, 2,000 on the south side, 2,000 on the west, and 2,000 on the north, with the town in the center. From there, they will have this area as pasture land for the town." Now, the Levites, of course, served in the tabernacle and were not involved in agriculture or commerce in any way. They were actually financially supported by the tithes and offering of the wider community of people. So while they didn't receive the large portions of land, they were given towns, and they were given areas around the towns or cities where they were allowed a designated, relatively small amount of land for any cattle and herds and animals that could graze there. Verse 4 and 5 discusses this in some detail, but the measurements to this day people find a bit confusing, because verse 4 mentions 1,000 units, about 500 yards around the city, while verse 2 mentions 2,000 cubits, which is about twice as much as that. So one view is that the 1,000 cubits are meant to be the town area, and the additional amount totaling 2,000 units includes the land around it. So there are 2 clear views. One view is that, but the other view is that there's 1,000 cubits for the town area and 2,000 additional cubits for the land around it, totaling 3,000 cubits. While I'm not going to try and answer that one, in reality, no one is able to say exactly what this measurement means. I'm sure they knew it at the time, but the way it's recorded leaves that ambiguity. But what we do know is that there's 48 cities with designated land, limited designated land for grazing livestock, and this land in total was either 2,000 or 3,000 cubits around each city. So either way, probably no more than about somewhere between a square kilometre and a square mile. So that's the principle, and the rest of the passage begins to discuss for us the purpose of these cities of refuge, which is the 6 towns that are going to be selected out of this wider group. Let's hear about that then. Verses 6 to 8. 6 of the towns you give the Levites will be cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone may flee. In addition, give them 42 other towns. So that's where we get the 48 for. In all, you must give the Levites 48 towns together with their pasture lands. The towns you give the Levites from the land the Israelites possess are to be given in proportion to the inheritance of each tribe. Take many towns from a tribe that have many, but few from those that have few. So I've mentioned from the beginning that there's 48 towns, didn't I? So here we see the 6 designated as these cities of refuge. The remaining are simply residential cities and towns for the Levites. So what's the purpose of all this, and what's the purpose of the special designation as cities of refuge? Well, it tells us that the cities of refuge exist so that any person who has killed another can flee to this place. This is for someone who has killed another person accidentally or claims they've killed another person accidentally, and if they do that, they can escape to a city of refuge for safety until they can stand trial. The passage then will go on to elaborate this system further and in some detail. Verse 8 explains how these cities are to be distributed among the tribes. The number of cities should be proportional to the size of that tribe in that area, meaning that larger populated areas would be designated with more of these cities and towns designated for these purposes, and the smaller tribes obviously fewer. Now, the Levites had various roles. Of course, they maintained the main temple, but one of them was teaching the word of God and applying it amongst the people all over the nation of Israel, now that they'd entered the land and would be spread out across the land, not just one homogeneous group traveling together. Now, according to the book of Joshua, we know that these cities are strategically placed. It actually says that no matter where someone lived, once they'd established themselves in the land, they were never going to be more than 10 miles from one of these Levite cities. This would ensure that both the teaching and the application of the law would be applied throughout the whole land, and that the guidance of the Levites upon moral and legal matters was accessible to everyone. And God plans this by providing these cities to ensure that his people everywhere in the new land have the ability to access spiritual guidance. And what it's talking about here in the subsect of 6 cities is refuge as well. This, take a wider look at it, really demonstrates to me God's provision and care for his people. But let's look deeper into the specific purposes behind these specific arrangements. Reading from verses 9 to 15, it tells us, "Then the Lord said to Moses, Speak to the Israelites and say to them, when you cross the Jordan into Canaan, select some towns to be your cities of refuge, to which a person who has killed someone may accidentally flee. They will be places of refuge from the avenger, so that anyone accused of murder may not die before they stand trial before the local assembly. These 6 towns you give will be your cities of refuge. Give 3 on this side of the Jordan and 3 in Canaan as cities of refuge. These 6 towns will be a place of refuge for Israelites and for foreigners residing amongst them, so that anyone who has killed another accidentally can flee there." You see, did you notice this term avenger? In ancient Israel, if someone killed another person, then the victim's relatives and someone known as an avenger of blood would have the right to seek out and kill the killer. However, these cities of refuge provided a place where someone who has killed in this way could flee for safety if they believed that what they did was what we today, I suppose, designate manslaughter or accidental death. They could flee there until a trial could determine whether the killing was truly accidental or was it in fact premeditated, what we would today call murder. Now, once this manslayer, so we call them, they reached this city of refuge, the Levites, who primarily, of course, were the ones who would reside in these cities, their role was to conduct a trial to determine if this killing had been intentional or accidental. If the killing was deemed premeditated, the killer would be handed over to the avenger of blood, who could, if they wish, under the law, kill that person. Some argue that they could, of course, choose to practice grace and mercy over judgment, but normally it would have led to death by execution of the avenger. But if it was accidental, the manslayer would then be able to stay in the cities of refuge until the currently residing high priest died. Leaving the city of blood during this time prematurely, while the high priest was still alive, would make them legally vulnerable to the avenger of blood. Now, verse 14 specified that the 3 cities are going to be established on each side of the Jordan, thereby again ensuring accessibility for all the Israelites. But interestingly, it's worth noting that these cities provided refuge not only for the Israelites, but also for foreigners living among them, emphasizing this wider aspect of the Israeli emerging state as being one that emphasized fair and just provision for everyone among them. Okay, next few verses, verses 16 to 21, to give us some more background. If anyone strikes someone a fatal blow with an iron object, that person is a murderer, and the murderer is to be put to death. Or if anyone is holding a stone and strikes someone with a fatal blow with it, that person is a murderer, and the murderer is to be put to death. Or if anyone is holding a wooden object that strikes someone with a fatal blow with it, that person is a murderer, and the murderer is to be put to death. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death. When the avenger comes upon the murderer, the avenger shall put that murderer to death. If anyone with malice aforethought shoves another or throws something at them intentionally so that they die, or if out of enmity one person hits another with the fist so that the other dies, that person is to be put to death. That person is a murderer. The avenger of blood shall put the murderer to death when they meet. So this passage is outlining the various scenarios and the various ways in which people can kill another person in order to distinguish a clear line between that which was designated murder and manslaughter. Verse 16 to 18 describe how various implements, like striking someone with iron or a large rock or a wooden weapon, in other words, anything that represents an intentional attack with a weapon, is to constitute murder, and those actions are punishable by death. And the role of the avenger of blood in being the person who is authorized to execute that punishment, the death of the murderer, providing it was intentional, is explained here. Now, verse 20 and 21, the fact that it focuses on defining murder as premeditated, malice aforethought, is specifying that the actions to be punished are ones that were taken out of hatred or lying in wait. That premeditation is the actual criteria that establishes something as worthy of what we would today call capital punishment. There is a contrast here to how intentional murder and accidental killings are to be treated. So we see today what we call the difference between manslaughter as having a different to murder, and it provides a different type of punishment designated, but only following that person facing a fair trial and that trial taking place in one of these cities of refuge. So the system of the cities of refuge is a way, you would say, of reflecting God's justice and mercy at the same time. The way ensuring that accidental killers, ensuring that people who have led to the death of another individual without malice aforethought or but just by accident could find safety and justice, and that any punishment that they would need to serve could be deemed, following a trial, designated properly, the punishment should be seen fairly and proportionally. And the city of refuge were the places where the laws governing all of this would take place. But don't miss the importance of the fact that murder is defined here in Scripture as needing a motive of what we would today call intentionality. That is the thing that determines both the guilt as murder and the punishment for murder in these days. Let's pick up the text 22 to 28. More examples are going to be given. But without enmity, someone pushes another or throws something at them unintentionally, or without seeing them, drops a stone or a heavy object enough to kill them and they die, then since that person was not an enemy and no harm was attended, the assembly must judge between the accused and the avenger of blood according to these regulations. The assembly must protect the one accused of murder from the avenger of blood and send the accused back to the city of refuge to which they fled. The accused must stay there until the death of the high priest, who was anointed with the holy oil. But if the accused ever goes outside the limit of the cities of refuge to which they fled, and if the avenger of blood finds them outside the city, the avenger of blood may kill the accused without being guilty of murder. The accused must stay in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest. Only after the death of the high priest may they return to their own property. So as I've said before, we see the distinction being explained to us in more detail between the different actions and the different consequences. It is here, friends, this is important to note, that for the first time in history, we see a very clear, crucial distinction between manslaughter and murder, emphasizing this element of premeditation. If someone kills another without this sense of malice aforethought, premeditation, or accidental, then that person can flee to this place for refuge and protection until a trial determines their fate based upon the principles outlined above. Determining intent is important, and scenarios where out and out accidental death has occurred, such as just pushing someone, such as just dropping something or pushing something, all actions not done without any sort of hatred behind them, the Levites would then judge that case and make those distinctions. And if they would determine that the killing was not premeditated in any way, then the lesser charge of manslaughter was brought, where they were spared execution. But note, they have to stay in the city of refuge. And the interesting, intriguing aspect of the term in which they are to stay there is determined by the lifespan of the high priest at that time. They have to stay in the city of refuge until the death of the high priest, after which they are actually allowed to return home. Now, the fact that there has to be a death of a high priest, some would say, adds another layer of symbolic atonement for us, in the sense that there would have to be a death to mark the atonement and the return to normality. So it seems that they're not getting off scot-free here. If it's designated as manslaughter, that would lead to them having to serve a sort of localized house arrest until the death of the high priest, upon which they would then be offered a release or a pardon. These verses make clear the consequences of leaving the city early, in the sense that the avenger of blood could if they did that before the death of the priest, they could take revenge, and by doing so, they wouldn't even be guilty of murder if they murdered that person. But if they stay and serve out that time after the high priests arrive, they can literally go home, and the avenger of blood would not be allowed to touch them. And in fact, if they did, they themselves, as we'll see, would be guilty of murder. So it underscores the necessity of the person found guilty of the lower charge of manslaughter. In order to remain safe, he has to adhere strictly to the protection offered by the city, which otherwise he still risks pain of death, which surely illustrates the seriousness with which even the offence of manslaughter was considered. Anyway, moving on, verses 29. This is to have the force of law for you and throughout the generations to come, wherever you live. Anyone who kills a person is to be put to death as a murderer only on the testimony of witnesses, but no one is to be put to death on the testimony of only one witness. Do not accept a ransom for the life of a murderer, because the murderer deserves to die. They are to be put to death. Do not accept a ransom for anyone who has fled to the city of refuge, and so allow them to go back and live on their own land before the death of the priest. So this opening verse 29, that first of all establishes these rules, this whole system, as a continuing perpetual statute. It underscores the importance of building in to the societal legal system something that has enduring process. It confirms that these rules are to be observed not just today but for future generations. And then it adds some more legal detail for us. It emphasizes a little bit of background about these trials that are going to take place in the city of refuge. It emphasizes the necessity of having multiple witnesses, more than one witness anyway, to convict anyone of murder. So it reflects a high standard of evidence is required before they could impose the death penalty in those days. And this principle would ensure fairness and thoroughness in judicial proceedings. The passage also strictly forbids accepting of a ransom for the life of a murderer, or allowing someone who's committed manslaughter to leave the city of refuge prematurely after paying a ransom. This all reinforces the fact that the sanctity of life, the seriousness of these things, and the fact that influence, power, or money could not buy you out of having to face the consequences at them. It stresses that this is the way in which the land will be protected from increasing bloodshed. It limits, so even at that time, those of you who might struggle with the concept of capital punishment can see that in this scenario, it limits the potential for murder and violence to increase and spread beyond these narrow boundaries. The high standard of evidence, along with the protection offered to those who are accidental killers, contribute to a comprehensive legal framework that balances the always difficult need for justice alongside the provision of mercy. This legal requirement about multiple witnesses in order to convict someone of murders ensures that accusations are always substantiated. It can't just be one-on-one. The justice system needs to be fair and reliable, and one witness is not sufficient in establishing guilt for this crime of murder, reflecting the importance of evidence in these serious matters. That personal feuds between individual people cannot be played out as way and in attempts to gain the system, if you like. It also prohibits the acceptance of ransoms for the life of a murder, emphasizing that justice cannot be bought and justice cannot be avoided. The only way to cleanse the land of the murderer's defilement, once it's been established that way, at this time is seen as execution of the murderer by the one who has been offended, the avenger of blood. And this strict rules and measures underscore the theological necessity of maintaining the land's purity, because that is where God's presence is. And the final verses in this chapter say for us, confirm this and say, do not pollute the land where you are. Bloodshed pollutes the land, and atonement cannot be made for the land in which blood has been shed, except by the blood of the one who has shed it. Do not defile the land where you live and where I dwell, for I, the Lord, dwell among the Israelites. So the whole passage emphasizes for us that allowing murderers to go unpunished or to buy their way to justice would defile the land. This passage insists on the necessity of punishing murderers, manslaughters, in a way that maintains the purity of the land, because God himself, remember at this point, is dwelling among the Israelites in the land. And these two final verses reiterate that. So for me, the two key observations in this chapter when taking the helicopter view is, first of all, it provides provision for the Levites. God is seen to provide for the Levites by allocating these 48 cities for them. There's provision, of course, being described, including financial support through tithes and offering. And it also says, they've been set apart, they've been given these regional areas in which the importance of their role is to establish teaching and maintaining the spiritual health of the community by the application of the Levitical law. But then it allocates these 6 further cities where those people accused of the most serious crimes, murder, manslaughter, they can flee to one of these 6 cities, and they're described as cities of refuge. They offer protection for any individuals who are potentially guilty of manslaughter instead of murder, thus ensuring that those who do that, or even just accidentally lead to the death of another person, have a place to flee to and receive a fair trial there. And the added detail about witnesses being required and that the system not being bought with money are added there as an additional layer of protection for all. So Numbers 35 outlines for us more detail of this legal framework that has been established through this chapter to ensure justice is for all and to maintain the sanctity of the land. And God here ensures that both spiritual leadership of the community and the protection of the not guilty and the punishment of the guilty and the protection of those and designating differences between accidental killings and murder are all established here. This system implements, many would say, the first legal system in history that underscores the importance of justice for all, combining that principle with the theological necessity of maintaining a pure and holy relationship with God. Here we see the principle of innocent until proven guilty is established here, and probably for the first time in human history. It certainly didn't exist in the code of Hammurabi, the code of system, that the only code of rules close to a legal system that existed before this, and this principles revealed here have remained fundamental to most world civilizations ever since. Historically, prior to this, in other civilizations, and that code I mentioned, an accusation alone was enough to lead to immediate punishment. But in contrast now, because of this and what we see here, ever since, most legal systems worldwide insist on proof before conviction, a concept that is rooted here and first revealed in biblical law. I think there's also a second principle established that's important for today, because in today's area of social media and cancel culture, the secondary principle, I would say, is one we need to pay well attention to, and that is, don't go rushing to judgment. The cities of refuge bought that period of time and consideration, and we too should not jump to conclusions, particularly fueled by media and public opinion. It's crucial to withhold judgment until all reasonable evidence is available and presented, and adhering to the principle of fair trial and due process is important. The relevance of this principle applies to many areas of our life today. Issues of justice and punishment, the idea of providing protection for the innocent and ensuring that only the guilty are punished is established here. Also the concept that you need some sort of rigorous proof, and that's the only way you can avoid convicting innocent people. It also highlights the need for a judicial system that is both fair and just, that can't be bought, thereby nature avoiding wrongful convictions, whilst at the same time ensuring that guilty people are held accountable. This passage, this chapter from Numbers, is as relevant today as ever. It offers the framework for justice, a justice that values human life above everything else, but still insists on proof before punishment. It also reinforces the sanctity of life by recognizing that human beings are created in the image of God, and that murder is the most serious crime, but also that there are gradients in the sense is manslaughter and accidental death, and it also provides mechanisms to ensure that justice is fairly administered across all levels of transgression. So I believe that this chapter provides us with a timeless lesson on justice, and the principles outlined in this passage can still inform our contemporary legal practices today, and in how we should relate to one another and not be quick to jump to conclusions, particularly based by news, social media posts, etc., ensuring that we uphold a balanced attitude to justice, whilst ultimately at its core recognizing and protecting the sanctity of life. This balance, I think, is essential to maintain a civilized society, a society that values fairness and righteousness, because it is that type of society that reflects God's own justice and mercy seen here for us today. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, friends, I'll close out quickly because I'm really trying to get these chapters done, one chapter today. So it's been a long message, but I hope you find it helpful. Can I remind you that if you've just joined us recently, then why not consider subscribing wherever you get your podcasts from, and that way you'll never miss another episode, or you need never miss another episode. You'll get a notification, and that way you can join me on this journey through the whole Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. Can I just flag up that there is an episode's notes as well as a full transcript of everything I say. If you don't see them on the platform you use to get your podcasts from, then visit us on thebibleproject.buzzsprout.com and you'll find all the links there for all those additional resources, as well as links to social media and the Patreon community if you want to get connected more with me over there and see the wider aspects of this ministry and the other stuff I'm doing. So that's it for today. Thank you for being with me, and I'll see you back here again tomorrow on the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Bye-bye for now.